The year is 1941. May 26. The North Atlantic is angry tonight. Gale Force 8 winds tear across a black, heaving ocean. Rain drives horizontally through the darkness. And somewhere in that chaos, 15 fabric-covered biplanes, aircraft that look like they escaped from a museum, are hunting the most technologically advanced battleship ever built, the Bismarck. 50,000 tons of German engineering. 8 15-inch guns that could punch through steel like paper. Armor plating thick enough to shrug off shells that would obliterate lesser ships. A vessel so modern, so powerful, that the British Admiralty diverted nearly every available warship to hunt it down. This was not just a battleship. This was a statement, a declaration, a symbol of what the Third Reich believed it could achieve. Total dominance of the Atlantic. And right now, it's being chased by planes made of cloth and wood, the Fairey Swordfish. Maximum speed, under 100 miles per hour. Wingspan, just over 45 feet. Construction, fabric stretched over a metal frame, held together with rivets and hope. These aircraft were already obsolete when the war began. They looked like something your grandfather might have flown in the previous war, perhaps at the Somme or Passchendaele. Pilots sat in open cockpits, exposed to the elements, goggles the only thing between their eyes and the stinging Atlantic spray. No heated cabins, no pressurization, just wind, rain, and the roar of a single radial engine struggling against the storm. Imagine this for a moment. Picture yourself standing on the deck of the Bismarck, watching these antiques approach through your anti-aircraft sights. They're slow, painfully slow. They're fragile. You can practically see the fabric rippling in the wind. They belong in a different era, a different war. Would you be worried? Or would you think this was some kind of elaborate joke? Perhaps a desperate British bluff? The Germans thought it was a joke. Some officers reportedly laughed when they first saw the swordfish formations approaching. How could these relics possibly threaten the most sophisticated warship afloat? History is full of these forgotten lessons. But here's the thing about history. It doesn't care what you think should happen. It only records what did happen. And what happened that night in the North Atlantic would fundamentally change naval warfare forever, not just for Germany, but for every navy on Earth. We spend our time in the archives, piecing together these moments, the decisions that seemed brilliant until they weren't, the assumptions that held right up until they shattered. To ensure you don't miss our next investigation into forgotten lessons that changed everything, join us by subscribing, because the Bismarck wasn't the first time technology met hubris, and it certainly wasn't the last. The illusion of invincibility. Let's rewind. Back to a time when German naval planners believed they created something unstoppable. Back to when confidence bordered on certainty. The Bismarck was commissioned in August of 1940. She was named after Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor who unified Germany in the 1870s. The symbolism was intentional, carefully calculated. Just as Bismarck had forged a nation from disparate states, this ship would unify the Atlantic under German control. Or so the plan went. Her statistics read like a wish list written by naval architects dreaming without constraints. Length, over 800 feet, longer than 2.5 football fields. Beam, 118 feet. Displacement, 50,000 tons fully loaded. Those 8 15-inch guns could hurl a shell weighing nearly 1 ton over 20 miles with devastating accuracy. Imagine a Volkswagen Beetle being thrown the distance of a marathon. That's the kind of power we're talking about. Her armor belt, the thick steel plating protecting her vital machinery, was over 12 inches thick in places. Shell hits that would cripple other vessels simply bounced off like pebbles thrown at a tank. Below decks, the ship was a marvel of engineering precision. Watertight compartments, redundant power systems, advanced fire control computers, analog, yes, but sophisticated for the era, that could calculate range, bearing, wind, and ship motion to put shells on target from miles away. Her propulsion system could push her to 30 knots, fast enough to outrun most pursuers, catch most prey. British intelligence knew about the Bismarck long before she sailed. They knew her dimensions. They knew her capabilities. They'd studied reconnaissance photographs and debrief informants. But knowing and experiencing are two different things. Reading about a tiger is one thing. Standing in front of one is entirely different. On May 18, 1941, the Bismarck left port from Gotenhafen, now Gdynia in Poland, accompanied by the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen. Operation Rheinübung, Rhine exercise, had begun. The objective was simple in concept, terrify in execution. Break out into the Atlantic shipping lanes and destroy Allied convoys. Strangle the supply lines that kept Britain fighting. Sink merchant ships faster than they could be replaced. Starve Britain into submission, or at least force them to negotiate a favorable peace. The strategic logic was sound. Britain was an island nation utterly dependent on imports, food, fuel, raw materials, everything. Sever those lifelines, and the war would be over without Germany having to invade across the Channel. The Bismarck, supported by U-boats and raiders, could make that vision a reality. The British response was immediate and overwhelming. The battleship HMS Hood, pride of the Royal Navy, the largest warship in the world for 20 years, a symbol of British sea power, sortied with the battleship HMS Prince of Wales to intercept. Additional ships scrambled from bases across Britain and Iceland. This wasn't just about stopping one ship. This was about protecting the very survival of the nation. On May 24th, they found the Bismarck in the Denmark Strait between Iceland and Greenland. The waters were cold, gray, forbidding. Visibility was marginal. But the hunters had found their prey. The perfect plan meets reality. What happened next should have been a fair fight. 2 British capital ships against 1 German battleship and a cruiser. Roughly even odds. Perhaps slightly in Britain's favor given the numbers. It lasted less than 10 minutes. The engagement opened at 05:52 hours. Dawn was just breaking. Pale light filtering through clouds. The Hood and Prince of Wales closed the range, guns training on their targets. The Bismarck and Prinz Eugen responded, turrets swinging smoothly into position. The Bismarck's guns found their range with terrifying efficiency. German optical rangefinders were among the best in the world, and the crew had trained relentlessly. First salvo missed but close. Second salvo, straddling the target, shells landing on either side. Third salvo, same. The gunners were walking their fire toward the Hood, making minute corrections with each volley. Fourth salvo, direct hit. The shell, or perhaps multiple shells, accounts vary, struck the HMS Hood directly, penetrating the lightly armored deck and detonating an ammunition magazine deep within the ship. The explosion was cataclysmic. Witnesses described a column of flames shooting hundreds of feet into the air, followed by a thunderous boom that echoed across the water. The Hood, all 42,000 tons of her, broke in half like a toy snapped by an angry child. Her bow section rose almost vertically, propellers still turning, before sliding beneath the waves. The entire sequence took under 3 minutes. Out of a crew of 1,000, for 118 men, 3 survived. 3. Let that sink in. 1,415 sailors, officers, engineers, gunners, gone in 3 minutes. Men who'd been eating breakfast, writing letters home, standing watch, erased in an instant. The Prince of Wales, damaged and outgunned, withdrew under heavy fire. Her crew fought valiantly, but she was a new ship with teething problems, gun turrets malfunctioning at the worst possible moment. But before retreating, she managed to land a critical hit on the Bismarck, a 14-inch shell that ruptured a fuel tank and caused flooding in the forward sections. It seemed minor at the time, barely worth mentioning. The kind of damage a ship this advanced could easily handle. A scratch on an elephant. But that single hit changed everything. The Bismarck was now leaking oil, leaving a telltale trail across the Atlantic like breadcrumbs in a dark forest. More critically, the flooding compromised her speed and range. Salt water contaminating fuel oil. Reduced maximum speed. Increased fuel consumption tried to maintain even moderate speeds. The mission, breaking out to hunt convoys, was no longer viable. The Bismarck had become the hunted rather than the hunter. Admiral Gunther Lütjens, commanding the operation from aboard the Bismarck, made a decision. They would make for the French port of Brest for repairs. It was a sensible choice, the logical choice. The Bismarck was still overwhelmingly powerful. Her guns still worked. Her armor was intact. Once repaired, she could sortie again. This was a tactical retreat, not a defeat, live to fight another day. Except the British Navy had other plans, and they had something the Germans hadn't adequately prepared for. Biplanes made of fabric, flying from carriers that could reach targets hundreds of miles from shore. The quiet warnings. May 25th, 1941. 0300 hours. The Bismarck vanished. 2 British cruisers, HMS Suffolk and HMS Norfolk, have been shadowing the German battleship since the Denmark Strait encounter, maintaining radar contact through fog and darkness. Their mission was simple but crucial. Don't lose her. Don't engage. Just keep her on your scopes and report her position, so the rest of the Royal Navy could converge like wolves closing on wounded prey. At 3 minutes past 3 in the morning, contact broke. The radar screens went blank. No return signal. No trace. No echo. The Bismarck, all 50,000 tons of her, had simply dissolved into North Atlantic like smoke and wind. She was there one moment, gone the next. British Admiralty went into overdrive. If the Bismarck reached a French port, she'd be untouchable, protected by coastal guns and Luftwaffe air cover. If she doubled back to Norway, they'd lose her entirely, and the entire chase would start over. And if she managed to slip into the convoy lanes despite her damage, disaster. Dozens of merchant ships sunk. Thousands of tons of supplies, food, ammunition, tanks, aircraft, destined for Britain sent to the bottom. The U-boats were already taking a terrible toll. Adding the Bismarck to that equation was unthinkable. Admiral John Tovey, commanding the home fleet from HMS King George V, faced a dilemma that kept him awake through the night. Which way did she go? Every hour without contact meant hundreds of square miles of additional ocean to search. The Atlantic is vast, empty, hostile. Finding one ship in that expanse is like finding a specific grain of sand on a beach. Fuel was running low on several of his ships. Destroyers were reaching their endurance limits. The margin for error was shrinking by the minute, ticking away with each passing hour. Catalina flying boats launched from bases in Scotland and Iceland, sweeping vast search patterns across gray, hostile water. These were long-range maritime patrol aircraft, slow, ungainly, but with the endurance to stay aloft for hours. Visibility was marginal. Cloud cover hung low, sometimes down to 500 feet, thick and gray like a wet blanket. Weather reports indicated deteriorating conditions. Wind 47 to 9, heavy seas. Rain squalls reducing visibility to near zero in some sectors. Flying in these conditions was dangerous. Crews strained their eyes searching for any sign, a wake, a shadow, a glint of metal. For 21 hours, the Bismarck was a ghost. 21 agonizing hours of uncertainty. The disconnect between maps and reality. Picture the operations room at the Admiralty in London. A large room, fluorescent lights, maps spread across tables. Pins and strings tracking known positions, projected courses, fuel endurance calculations. Staff officers in crisp uniforms drawing arcs with compasses, estimating where the Bismarck might be based on her last known heading and speed. Plotting courses on paper that represented life and death in reality. Except those calculations relied on assumptions. And assumptions have a nasty habit of being wrong, especially when the enemy doesn't cooperate. Admiral Lutjens, aboard the Bismarck, believed he was being shadowed continuously. Nobody had told him contact had been lost. In the fog of war, information flows imperfectly. So when German Naval Group West radioed him with lengthy messages, updates on U-boat dispositions, weather forecasts, strategic guidance, encouragement from the high command, he assumed the British already knew where he was. After all, if they'd been tracking him for days, what difference will radio transmission make? That was mistake number one. A critical misjudgment based on incomplete information. Those long radio transmissions gave the British exactly what they needed. Direction-finding stations across Britain and Iceland triangulated the signals. Sensitive equipment measuring the angle of incoming radio waves. The bearings converged on a map like lines pointing to treasure. Southeast, heading for France. The Bismarck wasn't retreating to Norway. She was making for Brest, The nearest friendly port would repair facilities that could handle a ship her size. Liu Chen's had handed them his position without realizing it, a navigator revealing his destination pursuers. At 10:30 in the morning on May 26, 31 and a half hours after contact was lost, a Catalina flying boat from Squadron 209 spotted a wake through broken cloud. Pilot Officer Dennis Briggs was near the end of his patrol sector, fuel running low, when his observer spotted something, a disturbance in the water, white foam against gray sea. Briggs ascended for a closer look, bringing the lumbering Catalina down to the cloud base. The aircraft broke through almost directly above the target. It was the Bismarck. The German battleship opened fire immediately. Anti-aircraft guns swiveled upward, crews reacting with trained efficiency. Shells burst around the Catalina, black puffs of smoke and shrapnel. Metal fragments punched holes through the fuselage, tearing through thin aluminum. Briggs with a lumbering flying boat back into cloud cover, engines roaring at full throttle, and transmitted the sighting report with shaking hands. Position, course, speed. The information Tovey desperately needed. The information that would seal the Bismarck's fate. The chase was back on. But there was a problem. Several problems. Actually, the weather turns. The North Atlantic doesn't care about your operational plans. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't compromise. By mid-afternoon on May 26, conditions were worsening rapidly. Northwest winds climbed to gale force 8, gusting higher, over 40 miles per hour, enough to tear spray from wave crests and reduce visibility to a gray blur. Seas built into gray-green walls 15 to 20 feet high, their crests torn into streaming spray that stung exposed skin like needles. Rain came in sheets, cutting visibility to less than a mile in some squalls. This was the North Atlantic in a foul mood, and ships pitching through these seas took a beating. Tovey's battleships, King George V and Rodney, were racing southeast, trying to intercept before the Bismarck reached air cover from French bases. But they were burning fuel at an alarming rate, pitching through the heavy seas, about crashing into waves and sending spray over the forward turrets. The engineers were calculating fuel consumption versus distance, and the numbers weren't encouraging. If they didn't catch her soon, they had to break off and refuel. The window was closing minute by minute. There was one more option, a desperate one. Force H, operating from Gibraltar under Admiral James Somerville, was racing north at flank speed. At the heart of Force H was the aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal, and aboard Ark Royal were the Swordfish torpedo bombers. 15 of them, crewed by men who'd trained for exactly the scenario. Young pilots and observers who'd practiced torpedo drops in calm Mediterranean waters. But this wasn't the Mediterranean. This was the North Atlantic in a storm. Except nobody had trained for weather like this. At 14:50 hours, 10 minutes before 3 in the afternoon, Ark Royal launched the first strike. 15 Swordfish lumbered off the pitching flight deck into howling wind and driving rain. The carrier was rolling through 30-degree arcs, deck rising and falling like a seesaw. Taking off meant timing your acceleration to catch the deck when it rose to meet you, then dropping off the bow into nothing. Engines screaming as you struggle for altitude. Landing, if they made it back, would be even worse. Try catching a arrestor wire on a deck that wouldn't hold still. The Swordfish climbed into thick cloud, fabric wings shuddering in the turbulence. Visibility dropped to zero almost immediately. Flying in formation became impossible. You couldn't see the plane next to you, just gray nothing. Each aircraft was alone in gray nothing. Instruments the only reference, needles trembling as pilots fought to maintain altitude and bearing. Then they found a ship through a break in the clouds. The fatal mistake. The lead pilots saw it clearly through a gap in the murk. A warship, roughly the right position, about the right size. It had to be the Bismarck. They began their attack runs, descending through the murk, torpedo bombers spreading into assault formation, coordinating through hand signals since radio was unreliable in the storm. One problem. It wasn't the Bismarck. It was HMS Sheffield, a British cruiser that had been sent forward to shadow the German battleship and provide homing signals for the strike aircraft. But in the chaos of the launch, the weather, and the fragmented communication, radio messages garbled by static, Signal flags invisible in the rain. Several swordfish crews hadn't gotten the message. They had outdated information. They thought any large warship in this sector had to be the target. They were about to torpedo their own side. Several crews realized the mistake at the last moment. Recognition features visible as they descended, the distinctive profile wrong for a German ship. They pulled away, aborting their attacks. Others didn't realize until later, after they'd released. Torpedoes splashed into the water, running straight and true toward a friendly ship. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on your perspective, the torpedoes were equipped with new magnetic detonators. Cutting-edge technology designed to explode beneath a ship's keel rather than on impact, maximizing damage by breaking the ship's back. Unfortunately, the magnetic detonators were temperamental, not fully debugged. Several exploded prematurely in the rough seas, magnetic sensors triggered by the turbulent water. Others malfunctioned entirely, running deep or failing to detonate at all. The Sheffield took evasive action. Shocked crew members watching fabric biplanes attacked them from their own carrier. Emergency maneuvers, throwing the cruiser into hard turns, wake foaming white. No hits, no damage, but several very close calls that left British sailors shaken and angry. The incident was embarrassing, potentially catastrophic, but it revealed something critical. The magnetic detonators couldn't be trusted in these conditions. The expensive, sophisticated technology was worse than useless. It was unreliable. The Swordfish limped back to Ark Royal through worsening weather, landing on a heaving, rain-slicked deck in near darkness, waves washing over the bow, arrestor wires snapping taut as aircraft caught them at the last second. It was dangerous, nerve-wracking work. Somehow, miraculously, all 15 aircraft made it back. Not a single loss, though several were damaged. Last chance. Aboard Ark Royal, the reality was stark and unavoidable. This was the last opportunity. The final roll of the dice. Tovey's battleships were hours away, burning fuel they didn't have, racing against time and mathematics. If the Bismarck maintained her current course and speed through the night, she'd be within range of Luftwaffe air cover by dawn. After that, untouchable. German fighters would swarm any British ships that came close. Bombers would attack from bases in France. The hunt would be over, and the Bismarck would escape. The Swordfish crews regrouped in the cramped ready room, peeling off soaked flight gear, hands shaking from cold and adrenaline. Maintenance teams swarmed over the aircraft, patching holes, refueling, checking systems, and, critically, replacing the unreliable magnetic detonators with simple contact pistols. Old technology, proven technology, the kind of detonator they'd used for years. You had to hit the target directly, but at least they'd explode when you did. At 1910 hours, 7:10 in the evening, 15 Swordfish launched again into the gathering darkness. The weather had gotten worse, if that was possible. Wind gusts topping 50 miles per hour, strong enough to throw a biplane sideways if you weren't careful. Rain horizontal, drumming on fabric like machine gun fire. The Ark Royal's deck pitching through angles that would have grounded flight operations in any sane scenario, any normal situation. But this wasn't sane. This was desperation. This was everything or nothing. The biplanes climbed into the storm, fabric wings shuddering in the turbulence, struts creaking under the strain, open cockpits offering zero protection from the elements. Pilots and observers exposed to wind that numbed faces and hands within minutes. Goggles streaming water, instruments barely visible. Pilots hunched behind their instruments, trying to read needles that trembled and jumped, hands frozen on the controls, fingers barely able to feel the stick. Below them, somewhere in that chaos of gray sea and darker sky, was the most powerful battleship afloat. A ship whose anti-aircraft guns could shred a Swordfish in seconds, turn fabric and wood into confetti. A ship that could outrun them if she could steer, outshoot them at any range. A ship that represented everything modern warfare was supposed to be: steel, fire, unstoppable force. The Germans knew the attack was coming. Radar had picked up a formation, blips on screens showing aircraft inbound. Gun crews stood ready, ammunition loaded into breeches, rangefinders tracking targets they could barely see through the storm. Watertight doors sealed. Damage control parties at their stations. Battle stations manned and ready. The Bismarck's captain, Ernst Lindemann, surely felt a moment of confidence. These were the same ridiculous biplanes that had attacked earlier, the ones that had almost torpedoed their own cruiser. Slow, obsolete, made of cloth, his ship had survived the hood. She'd taken hits from the Prince of Wales. Her armor was legendary. What could a handful of antiques do that modern battleships couldn't? He was about to find out. The Swordfish found the Bismarck at 2000 hours, 8 o'clock precisely. They split into smaller groups, attacking from multiple angles to divide the defensive fire, a tactic practiced countless times in training. Torpedo bombers dropping to wave height, skimming just above the gray water, engines screaming at full throttle, all 90 miles per hour of it, pathetically slow by modern standards, as they threaded through walls of flak. The anti-aircraft fire was intense, overwhelming. Tracers arced across the dark water, like deadly fireworks, red and green lines crisscrossing the sky. Heavy shells burst in black puffs, shrapnel sprang outward. Lighter weapons created a curtain of fire. Shrapnel sliced through fabric, punched in metal frames, cut control cables. One Swordfish took a direct hit that tore away part of its tail. The pilots somehow kept it flying, wrestling with controls that barely responded. One by one, they released. Torpedoes splashed into the heaving Atlantic, running true beneath the surface at 40 knots. Aim, timing, luck, everything depended on those three factors. And the last one most of all. 3 hits. 2 struck amidships. Impacts felt throughout the ship, but minimal damage. The Bismarck's armor absorbed them easily. Thick steel plates designed to withstand exactly this kind of attack. The torpedoes exploded against her side with massive concussions, but the hull held. Watertight compartments contained the flooding. The crew barely flinched. The third torpedo struck aft. Starboard side, near the stern, and everything changed. The single point of failure. 2000 hours, May 26, 1941. The torpedo, 18 inches in diameter, weighing over 1,600 pounds, carrying a warhead packed with over 700 pounds of high explosive, ran straight and true through the dark Atlantic water. It struck the Bismarck stern on the starboard quarter, just forward of the rudders. The impact location was almost random, the result of a pilot aiming as best he could through wind and rain and anti-aircraft fire, releasing at the right moment. Or perhaps the wrong moment, depending on your perspective. The explosion was relatively small compared to the massive detonations the ship's armor had already withstood. Certainly nothing compared to the 16-inch shells she was designed to endure. Damage control teams barely registered concern initially. 1 torpedo. Aft, far from any magazines or vital machinery. The magazines were intact. The engines were untouched. Power remained steady throughout the ship. Lights stayed on. Pumps worked normally. But beneath the waterline, something had broken that couldn't be fixed. Something that no amount of armor could protect. Something the designers had never adequately considered. The rudders, 2 massive structures that controlled the ship's direction, each weighing tons, were jammed at 12 degrees to port. 12 degrees doesn't sound like much when you say it. It's barely noticeable on a diagram, a slight angle. But at sea, traveling at even moderate speed, 12 degrees meant the Bismarck could only turn in one direction. She couldn't go straight. She couldn't turn right. She could only circle left, helplessly, like a wounded animal. She began to circle, tracing a path through the water that took her nowhere. Engineers rushed to the steering compartment, scrambling down narrow ladders and through hatches. Water was flooding in through damaged plating, knee-deep and rising. Hydraulic lines were severed, precious fluid leaking away. The steering gear itself, tons of mechanical precision designed to handle the enormous forces of moving a battleship through water, gears and shafts and hydraulic rams, was hopelessly jammed. They tried manual operation, strong men straining at emergency controls. Failed. The mechanism wouldn't budge. They attempted to disconnect the damaged rudder and steer with the remaining one. The damage was too extensive, too fundamental. The explosion had twisted metal, bent shafts, destroyed the very machinery that made steering possible. Captain Lindemann ordered engine manipulation to try to steer the ship by varying propeller thrust. Port engine forward. Starboard engine reverse. Tried to use differential power to force the ship in a different direction. It barely helped. The Bismarck could manage about 7 knots at best, still locked into a wide, slow circle that took her back toward the pursuing British fleet. 7 knots. Walking speed. The ship that could outrun nearly anything in the Atlantic, that could hit 30 knots when pushed, was now limping through a turn she couldn't escape, circling back toward her executioners. The irony takes hold. In the operations room deep within the ship, the reality settled like cold water, filling a sinking compartment. This wasn't the Hood's guns that had stopped them, not the Prince of Wales shells, not the concentrated firepower of Britain's most modern battleships. Ships that cost millions, that represented years of engineering and construction. A fabric-covered biplane, an aircraft that belonged in a museum, an aircraft that officers had mocked, an aircraft that seemed like a holdover from a previous era, had struck the one vulnerable point that rendered everything else meaningless. The Bismarck still had her guns. All 8 15-inch rifles remained operational, ready to fire. Her armor was intact, barely scratched despite everything. Her crew numbered over 2,000 trained sailors and officers, men who knew their jobs. Her fire control systems were still the most advanced afloat, capable of hitting targets over the horizon. In a straight gunnery duel, she could still trade blows with anything in the Royal Navy. She was still dangerous, still deadly, but she couldn't steer. And in naval warfare, maneuverability is survival. A ship that can't maneuver is a target, nothing more. Admiral Lutyens knew what was coming. He radioed Group West, transmitting in code. The ship was no longer able to maneuver. The words were clinical, emotionless, but everyone who read them understood the implications. He requested air support at first light, fighters from French bases, perhaps bomber squadrons to drive off the British ships that would inevitably converge. If the Bismarck could survive until dawn, there was still a chance. A slim chance, but a chance nonetheless. Through the night of May 26th into 27th, the Bismarck wallowed in heavy seas, unable to run, unable to hide, waiting for an enemy that was racing toward her position with murder in mind. British destroyers found her first, drawn by radio signals and radar contacts. They harassed her through the darkness, darting into launch torpedoes from point-blank range, then racing away before her guns could find them to murk. Fast, agile, impossible to hit in the darkness and rough seas. The destroyers scored no meaningful hits. The Bismarck's armor was too thick, her compartmentalization too good, but they kept the German crew at battle stations all night. No rest, no respite, no chance to repair the damage. Just a constant threat circling in the darkness like sharks around wounded prey. The morning of reckoning. Dawn on May 27th broke gray and cold, the sun hidden behind thick cloud cover. At 0800 hours, 8 o'clock in the morning, lookouts aboard the Bismarck spotted shapes on the horizon. Big shapes, getting closer with every minute. HMS King George V and HMS Rodney, 2 British battleships with combined firepower that dwarfed anything the Bismarck could answer alone. 10 14-inch guns on King George V, 9 16-inch guns on Rodney, the largest guns in the Royal Navy, each capable of throwing a shell weighing over a ton. They had her range. They had her position. And she couldn't run. She could only sit and take what was coming. At 0847, Rodney opened fire from 23,000 yards, over 13 miles. The British shells, 16-inch projectiles from Rodney, 14-inch from King George V, began walking toward the Bismarck like the footsteps of giants. The first salvos fell short, throwing up massive columns of white water that rose and fell back into the sea. Range corrections transmitted, calculations made. Fire again. Closer. The shells were enormous, each one capable of punching through feet of steel armor. The Bismarck returned fire with everything she had. Her forward turret swung toward the targets. Training with the mechanical precision German engineering was famous for. She fired. The shells arced across the gray morning, splashing close to the British battleships, close enough to drench their decks with spray. Her gunnery was still superb, her crews still professional. But she was a nearly stationary target, wallowing in the swell, and they were maneuvering freely, zigzagging, presenting difficult firing solutions. By 0900 hours, barely 15 minutes into the engagement, a British shell struck the Bismarck's forward fire control director. The optical rangefinder shattered, delicate lenses and prisms smashed into fragments. Targeting became guesswork, relying on backup systems that were less accurate. Another shell penetrated the forward superstructure, exploding inside and killing most of the command staff. Admiral Lutjens died somewhere in those first terrible minutes, his body never identified among the wreckage. Just one more casualty. The British closed the range, walking forward like boxers sensing a knockout. 20,000 yards, 18,000, 15,000. At that distance, even the Bismarck's heavy armor couldn't keep out the shells. Physics is unforgiving. Armor that could withstand hits at long range became vulnerable at close range. The shells arriving with more energy, hitting at steeper angles. The collapse. What followed wasn't a battle, in any traditional sense. It was execution, destruction, a killing. Shell after shell slammed into the Bismarck, impacts coming every few seconds. Her forward turrets fell silent, mechanisms destroyed, crews killed or driven from their posts. Her secondary armament kept firing, smaller guns, anti-aircraft weapons, anything that could still shoot, but it was futile, meaningless, like throwing stones at tanks. The British ships were too heavily armored, too far away for the smaller guns to be effective. Fires erupted across her superstructure, flames and smoke rising into the gray sky. Smoke poured from dozens of shell hits, black and oily. Her decks, once pristine showcases of German naval power, polished steel and paint, were torn into twisted metal and shattered equipment. Gun mounts bent, railings torn away, superstructure reduced to wreckage. Below decks, flooding spread through compartments breached by shells that punched through her side armor at close range, water rushing in faster than pumps could handle. By 1000 hours, 10 o'clock in the morning, the Bismarck had been reduced to a floating wreck. She was still afloat, testament to German shipbuilding, to the strength of her construction, but she was no longer fighting back. No guns remained in action. Fires raged unchecked, spreading through damaged compartments. Listing heavily to port, the ship was dying by increments, settling lower in the water minute by minute. Admiral Tovey, watching from King George V, was running critically low on fuel. He'd expended most of his ammunition, magazines nearly empty. The job needed finishing, but his battleships couldn't stay much longer. He ordered the cruiser HMS Dorsetshire to close and deliver the final blow with torpedoes. Dorsetshire maneuvered to within 3,000 yards, point-blank range by naval standards, close enough to see details through binoculars. She fired 3 torpedoes from one side. 2 struck home, massive explosions along the Bismarck's starboard side. The battleship rolled further to port, her list increasing. Her stern began to settle, sinking lower. At 10:39 on the morning of May 27, 1941, the Bismarck capsized and sank. She rolled to port, bottom visible for a moment, red paint and barnacles, before sliding beneath the waves. She went down in over 2 miles of water, for 100 miles west of Brest, the port she'd been trying to reach when a fabric biplane changed everything. The safe harbor that might as well have been on the moon. The human cost. The Bismarck had sailed with over 2,200 men. Young men, many on their first major voyage. Old hands who'd served in the Imperial Navy during the previous war. Officers who'd trained for years at naval academies. Cooks, mechanics, medics, communication specialists, all the roles that keep a warship functioning. Dorsetshire and other British ships began picking up survivors from the oil-slicked water. Exhausted men, many wounded, clinging to wreckage in the cold Atlantic. Hypothermia setting in within minutes in water this cold. 110 were pulled from the sea before a false U-boat alarm forced the British ships to withdraw. Captains face an agonizing choice. Stay and rescue more, potentially exposing their own ships and crews to submarine attack, or leave and abandon men in the water. They left. They had to. 110 survivors. 110 men, out of over 2,200. Over 2,000 men went down with the ship, sailors who believed they were crewing the most powerful warship afloat, officers who'd planned for convoy raids and Atlantic dominance, engineers who'd maintained machinery that represented the peak of German technology, men with families, homes, dreams, futures, all gone in minutes. The senior surviving officer was a junior gunnery officer named Burkhard von Mullenheim-Rechberg. He'd been stationed in the aft fire control position when the ship went down, isolated from the main superstructure. Decades later, he would write Battleship Bismarck, a survivor's story, one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of the operation. Reading it, you sense the lingering disbelief even decades removed. The feeling that this outcome shouldn't have been possible. That somewhere, somehow, the universe had played a trick on German naval planning. The Bismarck had survived 8 months of Baltic operations, training cruises and exercises. She destroyed the pride of the Royal Navy in minutes. She'd taken hits from modern battleships and kept fighting. Her armor, her guns, her engineering, all of it was exactly as advertised. The finest Germany could build, the best of the best. But none of it mattered when a 1930s biplane, flying through a storm that should have grounded all aircraft, put one torpedo in exactly the wrong place. Or perhaps, from the British perspective, exactly the right place. The silence after the storm. By noon on May 27th, the North Atlantic had returned to its indifferent routine. The waves that had been stained with oil and debris gradually dispersed, currents carrying contamination away. The wreckage, lifeboats, fragments of superstructure, personal belongings, bodies, sank or drifted away on the current. Within hours, there was almost no surface evidence that one of history's most powerful battleships had been there at all. The ocean had swallowed her, claimed her, erased the evidence, as if the Bismarck had never existed. The Bismarck lay 2,000 fathoms down, over 12,000 feet, crushed by pressure that would flatten a human instantly, resting on an underwater mountain 400 miles from the French coast she'd been trying to reach. Over 2,000 men were entombed with her, sailors, officers, engineers, gun crews, all caught in a tactical disaster that began with a single jam rudder and ended in complete destruction. In Britain, the news broke like thunder, spreading rapidly. The BBC announced it within hours. The Bismarck has been sunk. 5 simple words that carried enormous weight, enormous relief. 3 days earlier, the Hood, the symbol of British naval supremacy, the ship that represented everything the Royal Navy believed about itself, had been destroyed in minutes. The shock and grief were still raw, still fresh. 1,415 men lost, only 3 survivors, families destroyed, the nation reeling. Now, the score was settled, not equalized. Nothing could bring back the Hood's crew, nothing could restore those families, but answered, avenged. British newspapers ran headlines celebrating the achievement. Bismarck sunk, revenge of the Hood. Atlantic menace destroyed. Radio broadcasts described the hunt and the kill in dramatic terms. Winston Churchill addressed Parliament, his voice strong and triumphant, praising the Royal Navy's determination and skill. What most accounts didn't emphasize, what wouldn't be fully understood for years, was the sheer improbability of how it happened. The official reports mentioned swordfish torpedo bombers. They noted the critical rudder damage. But the full irony, that fabric biplanes flying at 90 miles per hour had crippled the most modern battleship afloat, took time to sink in, to be fully appreciated. The German response. In Germany, the reaction was very different. Where Britain celebrated, Germany mourned and raged. Adolf Hitler was furious when he received the news. Not grieving. Furious. The Bismarck had been a propaganda triumph when she launched, featured in newsreels and newspapers. She'd been showcased as proof of German engineering superiority, naval resurgence, the new order that would dominate the seas. Her destruction of the Hood had validated everything Hitler wanted to believe about German military might, about the superiority of German arms and soldiers. Her sinking 8 days into her first operational mission shattered that narrative completely. It made Germany look weak, fallible, vulnerable. It suggested that British technology and tactics could counter German might. Hitler's distrust of surface ships, already substantial given the cost and vulnerability of large warships, hardened into ironclad policy. Why risk expensive battleships when they could be hunted down and destroyed? Why invest billions in ships that ended up on the bottom after a week? The Bismarck had proven you could have the best armor, the biggest guns, the most advanced fire control, and still end up at the bottom of the ocean because one torpedo hit in the wrong place, because one lucky shot jammed your rudder. From that point forward, German capital ships were increasingly restricted to Norwegian waters or kept in port as fleets in being, threats that tied down British resources simply by existing, without ever risking actual combat. The Tirpitz, Bismarck's sister ship, spent most of her operational life hiding in Norwegian fjords, never engaging the kind of Atlantic raiding the Bismarck had attempted. She tied down significant British resources. Carriers and battleships kept in home waters in case she sortied, but she never achieved what she was designed to do. The German surface fleet's offensive capability effectively ended on May 27, 1941. Not because the ships were destroyed, most remained afloat for years, but because confidence in their invulnerability died with the Bismarck. The psychological impact was devastating. If the Bismarck could be sunk, any ship could be sunk. The cost of assumptions. Let's step back and examine what actually went wrong. Let's look at the failure clinically, analytically. The Bismarck wasn't sunk because German engineering failed. The ship performed exactly as designed. Her armor protected her vital spaces through hundreds of shell hits. Her guns were accurate and devastating until they were destroyed. Her machinery ran smoothly even after sustaining damage. Her compartmentalization kept her afloat long after she should have sunk. When she finally went down, parts of her structure were so intact that debate continues to this day about whether she was scuttled by her crew or sunk by British action. The truth appears to be both. She was mortally wounded, and her crew hastened the end by opening seacocks, ensuring she wouldn't be captured. The failure was strategic, not mechanical. Conceptual, not engineering-based. German naval planning assumed that speed and firepower would allow battleships to break into the Atlantic, devastate convoys, and withdraw before concentrated opposition could respond. It was a reasonable assumption based on World War I experience and early war successes. Surface raiders had achieved significant success in the previous war. What German planners didn't adequately account for was the evolution of carrier-based air power, the ability to project force hundreds of miles beyond gun range. The swordfish biplanes were obsolete by any reasonable standard. Slow, lightly armed, vulnerable. But they had one critical advantage. They could operate from carriers hundreds of miles from land. That meant British naval forces could project striking power far beyond gun range, attacking targets that surface ships couldn't reach without exposing themselves to counterfire. The Bismarck's designers had protected against shells and torpedoes from ships. They'd installed anti-aircraft guns to defend against modern aircraft. What they hadn't fully appreciated was that even primitive aircraft, if they could get close enough, represented a threat to essential systems like steering gear. Systems that were difficult to armor, difficult to protect, difficult to make redundant. One torpedo, one critical hit. The entire operational plan collapsed like a house of cards. Final reflection. History is littered with moments like this. Moments of profound irony. Invincible armies defeated by unconventional tactics. The Mongols destroying heavily armored European knights with mobility and archery. Impregnable fortresses bypassed rather than assaulted. The Maginot Line rendered irrelevant by German tanks rolling through Belgium. Technological superiority undone by a simple failure at a critical moment. The Bismarck stopped by a jammed rudder. The Bismarck story reminds us that confidence, even when backed by impressive capability, even when supported by solid engineering and brave crews, is not the same as invincibility. That complexity creates vulnerabilities as much as it creates capabilities. That sometimes the most devastating blow comes from the direction you weren't watching, from the threat you dismissed as irrelevant. The German Navy built the most advanced battleship in the world. They invested years of planning, millions of Reichsmarks, the best engineering minds available. The Royal Navy sent fabric biplanes to stop it, aircraft that looked like they belonged in a different war in a different era. On paper, that sounds absurd, laughable, impossible. In reality, it worked. If you found value in this investigation into one of World War II's most improbable outcomes, join us for the next deep dive into history's forgotten ironies. Subscribe to ensure you're here when we uncover the next lesson the archives have been waiting to teach. Because we're not just telling stories, we're investigating patterns, examining decisions, understanding the moments when confidence met reality and lost. Because the past isn't just about what happened. It's about understanding why and recognizing the patterns before they repeat. The next time someone tells you something is invincible, impossible to defeat, too advanced to fail, remember the Bismarck. Remember that fabric biplanes can sink battleships. Remember that assumptions are dangerous. Remember that wars are won not by the side with the best technology, but by the side that adapts fastest when their assumptions prove wrong. The Bismarck sailed once. She was sunk by biplanes made of cloth. And in that single tragic voyage, she taught lessons that navies around the world are still learning today.